Hey, so today I'm going to be working on this 3D printed MegaMan helmet. I wanted something fun to do, and I figured what better than to make an item from one of my favorite video game series. The original creator of this MegaMan helmet is Cerberus Noir. I'll leave a link in the description. Now, before printing this out, I imported the Mohawk into Blender and hollowed it out and made these extra little bits to go inside of there. I used my elegoo Jupiter to print all the pieces out, since I didn't have to split the helmet in half, and I also was able to print all the pieces in one go. For resin, I chose Ceratec Fast Gray, since it's a non-brittle resin and it's quite durable compared to other cheap resins out there. Now, before we can start assembling this, I need to go through and remove all the imperfections from 3D printing, such as the lip at the bottom of the pieces, as well as the little bumps from the support removal. Now, nobody likes sanding, but in my opinion, it's the most important step to getting a nice smooth surface finish. For this project in particular, I found using this nail file worked really well to quickly level out the bumps and imperfections. Unlike sandpaper, it's rigid enough to be comfortable to use without much force, but also has just enough flex to conform to slightly rounded objects such as these. Next, I just need to adjust these pieces so they'll fit inside the Mohawk part. For the rod, I just cut it down with a little cutoff wheel, and the other ones I sanded them down, and then I used a little ball burr to widen the holes. Now that that's done, we can start assembling all the pieces. For this, I used BSI's medium gap filling superglue. When using the accelerator, instead of using the standard spray bottle, I like to use these little needle droppers to carefully apply a small amount of it where needed, as opposed to spraying it all over the model. And whenever I'm gluing something together, I always like to keep some super glue remover nearby, just in case of an accident, such as the pieces not aligned or gluing my finger to the model, which has happened before actually. Well, now that we got it all mostly assembled and all the pieces glued together except for these little guys, which fit right here in the ears, we're going to come back to do something interesting with those. Before we can do the final sanding and starting with the paint job, we gotta fill in all these little cracks right here and along in the front. So we're gonna fill in all those with some of this spot putty and then sand that down, get it ready for painting, and then we'll get on to the next step. To apply the Bondo filler, I use these silicone tip tools meant for clay sculpting. They work really well for pushing the filler deep into the cracks without applying too much at once. This stuff is meant to be applied in thin layers, so if it's too thick, it can end up cracking as it dries. So since some of the gaps were quite large, it actually took 3 or 4 applications to completely fill, while other spots only took 1. And since you've already watched me sand the whole helmet once, I'm going to skip over that and get right to the next step of battle damaging it. Now, when it comes to battle damaging something, if you've never done it before, it can be pretty difficult to figure out exactly what to do. For me, I found taking time to visualize the story you're trying to convey and to consider the material it's supposed to be. In this case, it's metal along with how it could be damaged in the universe it's from. For this, I was thinking of energy blasts and swords that can melt the metal, piercing bullets, as well as minor scrapes from lots of use. I really wanted something that looked like MegaMan just went through an intense battle and took some serious damage. There are many different ways to create different effects depending on the material, but for this being a hard plastic, I found it quite easy to carve an area like this using a large ball burr, while for the smaller bullet marks, a small one worked much better. To make cut marks, I used a combination of both a disc-like burr and a simple hand file. The file itself did a great job of slowly adding the depth and final shape to each cut, as well as making small chips and scrapes along the edges that might have seen a lot of wear and tear. Now that I carved out where I wanted all the damage to be, it's time to go back and add some extra texture and really add some depth to each of the marks. For this, I used the same silicone tools from earlier to apply a small amount of Mr. White Putty to all the cuts. Then for the large blast mark, I used a sponge and alcohol to apply small amounts where it could have been melted and just give it a bit more grainy, uneven feel to it. Then for the final bit of details, I wanted to add some wires coming out from the helmet. I was really considering using actual wire for electronics at this point, but since I would like to position them exactly where I wanted to, I decided to use a few different sizes of copper wire instead. I just roughly cut a few lengths for each side, and once they were glued into place, did a final trim. The exact position on them doesn't really matter just yet until the painting's all finished. Now moving on to painting, we need to start with a nice even coat of primer and wait for that to completely dry. Once dry, we can use an airbrush and apply the base coat. For this I found this really nice deep metallic blue, and instead of doing a solid coat, I avoided spraying the edges to give a simple highlight effect. Now at this point I had completely forgotten that the helmet was two different shades of blue and ended up painting the inside of the large blast with black before having to go back and mask off both the ears and the mohawk pieces. To get around the ears and centerpieces with regular masking tape would be quite difficult, so I used a combination of Tamiya's different hobby masking tapes. One is like a normal masking tape, but with a smaller width to it, while this other one is much different as it is almost like a rubber and can make nice smooth bends around round objects, even on a non-flat surface like this one. Once I got all the edges done, I used the regular masking tape to cover all the larger areas. I then painted it with a lighter shade of blue and still avoided the edges. It didn't create the same highlight effect, but it did create a nice gradient effect that I think turned out quite nice. After I removed all the masking tape, I noticed little bits of the paint in some spots got pulled up with it, and that was only with using the cheaper large masking tape, not with the Tamiya brand ones. Next time I'm going to try a different brand for the larger areas. Now before we can do the final weathering and highlights on the helmet, we need to paint and glue these little earpieces in, which I decided instead of painting them to make a one-part mold out of these ones and cast some new ones out of a red translucent resin so that we could backlight them with a simple LED circuit board. And here's how they turned out. For gluing the red gems in, I used the extra thick super glue this time since the gap was quite large and I really didn't want it to leak out to the front of the ear and screw anything up. And with them glued in place now, it's completely assembled and we can start the fine painting details that really make everything stand out. I started with using a small brush to get to the hard to reach areas inside of the broken cavity. Just doing this little area took just as long to airbrush the whole thing. After that though, I used a simple black wash over the whole entire thing to add some extra dirt and grime into all the divots and break up the current almost perfect looking paint. With it looking properly dirty, we can move on to doing the highlights. Now for this part, I usually see people use one bright chrome color and call it done at that, but I didn't think that would look so great for this, so I started with a darker silver and went over all the different spots that needed highlights, and then came back around with a second coat, but this time with a brighter chrome, only on the sharper edges to create more depth to the effect. And lastly, I used a toothpick to paint the tips of the wires with copper paint. The very last thing we need to do is make a little circuit board that makes one LED blink. Now this took me way longer than I would have liked to find a working circuit for this, and I really don't understand how it works, so we're just going to get to gluing it in and then show the final result. And with that, it's finally finished. I really like how it turned out, but I think if I had to do something differently, I probably would have switched to an Arduino board as opposed to the simple circuit board that I used. It took significantly longer than I thought to do, and I think with the Arduino board I would have had a lot more control over the flickering and as opposed to just a simple blinking LED. Anyway, if you want to help support the channel, there will be links down in the description for all the products I use in this video. And if you'd like to see more tutorial videos like this or more projects, let me know which kind down in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching.